This video is part 2 of the chapter on postmodernism and the return of expression. Another designer associated with Pushpin Studio was Paula Scher, and she was the art director for CBS Records between 1974 and 1982. Along with the poster craze that people were collecting posters, the fans collected certain albums because of their highly regarded covers. The bands were often involved with selecting the designs, and the album imagery really served as a sort of branding for the musical groups. This cover for Boston the design was overseen by Paula Scher, and this was the Boston's first album. And it really became one of the most recognizable images of the 1970s. The illustration was airbrushed by Roger Hyson, and the Boston logo was designed by Gerard Huerta, but Paula Scher was sort of credited with the art direction and design. And really, this whole idea of the science fiction fantasy space illustration became the mainstay of 1970s graphics. Boston then became the most successful albums of the 1970s, selling over 6 million copies. Which is interesting because critics considered the cover or the music not to be particularly good, but I think just because of the design and the look of it, it just sold tons of copies. And Paula Scher later joked that she was horrified at the thought that her epitaph would read art director of the original Boston album. She definitely didn't want to be known for it. So this is an album cover for the band called XTC by the British firm Hypnosis. And it was founded by Aubrey Powell and Storm Thorgerson. Their design rejected the dependence on dramatic images and just used typewriter type. So it was just a block of white type on black background, the lettering being used as a graphic as well as a textural element. In 1978, Paula Scher designed the cover for an album of Japanese music by a flautist by Jean-Pierre Rampal. And you can see here she started to use collage and some copies of ukiyo-e prints, which harkens back to the Art Nouveau period, creating this composition. And it's really an example of the trend by which graphic designers used imagery at will, without really following a set of design principles. I would kind of challenge you to take a look at this and even try to find any kind of grid in this work. And the typography in the cover is reminiscent of Japanese text, which was usually vertically composed, but, also looks like signage from American streets with their shadowed capitals enclosed in ruled boxes. You think of like theater signs and different things like that. So in 1985, Paula Scher and Stephen Heller collaborated as co-editors on an issue of Print magazine. And this issue was intended as an enormous farce. It was sort of became a big joke. And the articles skewered aspects of the design world, such as the Swiss style and corporate identity, and what appeared to be an informative chart. So they called it the complete genealogy of graphic design. But if you looked closer at it, the information was really just nonsensical. So they would couple people and typefaces, which kind of then produce almost like a family tree. And really typical of the postmodern mindset, they imply skepticism about the coordination of such comprehensive knowledge, almost trying to say that it doesn't really matter. And it becomes a parody, and it was really representative of the growing attention to graphic design history that characterized the era. And even as alternatives to the international style grew in number, designers really paid more attention to their field's own history. So this is when people were really looking back. In the postmodern age, it's really not unusual for images to contain inside jokes that really only people that understood graphic design would understand. Paula Scher did magazine advertisements for the Swatch watch company and created almost an exact recreation of a famous travel poster by the Swiss designer Herbert Motter. Motter's poster demonstrates the constructed constructivist typophoto technique of a person floating at the top of the image and looking into the distance. So you can compare the two. The one on the right was by Herbert Motter, and Paula Scher created the sort of an ad for Swatch, really basing it on the style from the 1930s. And while some designers sort of recognized the irony of Scher's historicist use of the Swiss poster, the average viewer might say that, oh, all she did was just like rip off the original image. She was actually criticized for taking the image out of context and parodying it, as some designers really saw this type of close copying of the original as plagiarism. So I'm not sure how you feel about that, but, I think in this day and age, it's really hard not to be influenced by designs from the past. Which brings us to the sort of a strategy that some designers used called detournement. And this was really some of the movement, the postmodern graphic design movement, was marked by the work of the Situationist International, which was a French avant-garde group that grew between 1957 and 1972. And really, they played a key role in the civil insurrection that rocked France in the May of 1968. So what they did with this strategy called detournement was to show certain elements of the mass media and reinterpreting them to really undermine the original intent. So what detournement actually means is deflection or redirection. Sort of like the Dadaists, it originated as a way to subvert the mainstream, but really broke through into the mainstream culture. And an example of how this was effectively utilized in graphic design is in the cover art of the Sex Pistols single God Save the Queen. This was designed by Jamie Reed, and you can see that both of Jamie Reed and his friend and the band's manager, Malcolm McLaurin, had participated in student protests in 1968. And then for this artwork, they repurposed an official photograph of Queen Elizabeth II, and they took it and detorned it, quote unquote, meaning posting words and letters that obliterated the Queen's eyes and mouth. So they put the text, God Save the Queen, and then the band name Sex Pistols over her face. Sort of this crude ransom note style, which really conveyed the contempt for the British monarchy at the time, which was also expressed in the lyrics of the Sex Pistols song. The Sex Pistols' anger at society, irreverence, raw lyrics, and their really aggressive music turned them into an influential force in the British punk culture. This was an album done by Malcolm Garrett, and this was for the Buzzcocks single Orgasm Addict, which features a collage. It references both punk rock detournement as well as sophisticated sense of a parody that really kind of arose as part of the pop art movement. So this idea of putting, mouths where the breasts are and iron by the person's head. And it really shows a confrontational spirit of punk, along with a sophisticated aim of examining how women's bodies circulated in the mass media. And this also is a theme that was a concern of the British pop artists. So in the 60s and 70s, many new typefaces were designed as alternatives to the popular sans serifs that were widely used. And you saw some of them being hand-drawn, especially on those psychedelic posters. But they also wanted to create typefaces that could be reproducible, that other people could use. So in 67, Herb Lubalin was asked by Ralph Ginsberg to design the logo for his new magazine, Avant-Garde. He wanted to use an updated sans serif that would really express an awareness of the modern tradition. And the Avant-Garde logo was so popular that he designed a full typeface in 3 weights out of the original logo. And it was released by the International Typeface Corporation. And it was really popular during the 70s and appeared on a lot of different types of publications. ITC became one of the first type publishing companies that licensed typefaces to publishers without taking part in the printing process itself. So Lubalin promoted the company through a magazine he called U and LC, which mean, upper and lower case. It was cheaply produced, one color on an inexpensive newsprint type paper, and it was really a platform to promote the typefaces, as well as giving the authors the ability to explore a diverse range of design and culture-related topics. So another common typeface of the 1970s was Souvenir, that was designed by Ed Benguet. And you can see here this, it's a serif typeface, but they're soft fluid shapes, rounded corners, another aspect of the rejection of Helvetica's straight lines and sharp corners. And it really demonstrates the postmodern nostalgia for the decorative elegance of Art Nouveau. So it definitely has a lot of Art Nouveau leanings. The official, quote-unquote, postmodern movement arose in Basel, Switzerland during the early 70s among a group of students and their inspirational teacher, Wolfgang Weingart. I've actually got some books that he wrote, but he was born and raised in Germany, and he was actually a hot metal typesetter. And he came to the practice of graphic design from the production side of things, which really influenced his work. He moved to Basel, Switzerland, and accepted a teaching position at the AEG, where Armin Hoffman still taught. The school really had a stylistic openness, which was an important influence on Weingart, who was really one of the first designers to kind of abandon the Swiss design. He reevaluated the international style, and even though his work was still kind of informed by it, he kind of worked deliberately going against the Swiss designers who revered the grid and kind of worked away from the grid. He felt that it was important for any design to feature a strong structure and a logical composition, which was taken from his roots in the Swiss style, but he pushed those limits. He pushed the aesthetic limits in a way that kind of formed a natural progression, similar to Armin Hoffman's experimental works with his poster for Gazelle. So this is a poster that Weingart created for a calligraphy exhibition, and it really shows a lot of the different elements of his work. You can see that there is an underlying grid, but the rectangular frame seems to be overlaid on another rectangle that peers out of the edges. You can kind of see that right here, giving it a sense of depth and dimension. The outer band has triangles and stripes to create kind of this idea of kinetic movement. And while all of these elements are international style, the sans serif type, the grid, geometric shapes, the composition seems to be a little bit unhinged, which really allows the forms to move around the poster at will. And you can even see an idea of texture, layering, all that kind of stuff, which came from his production background. Because he had that technological background, this is why he could use a more stylistic variety in his work. He used transparent films, which allowed him to experiment with overlapping forms. He used more than 1 to 2 sizes of type. And really, his work at times have been called the New Typography, which was a reference to the revolutionary nature of his attacks on the sanctity of the international style. So here's another poster that in color for the 1984 Exhibition for Swiss Posters, which shared some stylistic devices from the previous poster that I showed you. These overlapping planes, the shift of being transparent compared to opaque, the enlarged dots from a halftone screen, and really the comparison between the two posters is important because he has consistent stylistic elements that show how most postmodern work, though they reject certain principles, is not like a free-for-all. So there still is an underlying thought and consideration for visual hierarchy, readability, all that kind of stuff. So really not quite the chaos of the Dada. And during his tenure at Basel, a number of American students traveled to Switzerland to study with him. And two of those students were Dan Friedman and April Greiman. Dan Friedman was trying to create a new individual style, and he met April Greiman, who had just returned from a year in Switzerland studying with Weingart, and together they really popularized the Swiss designer's approach in the United States. In the 1970s, Friedman rejected the absolutism of legibility replacing it with a more sort of open-ended term, readability, meaning that as long as it had an overall sense of being able to communicate, then it was a successful design. He remained a little bit more open to the international style, but, never was it like an overwhelming part of his designs, but he didn't reject it outright. So this is a poster that he did with collaborating with April Grieman, and you can see the postmodern elements with the quirky mix of lettering. You've got this bold sans serif, this very high contrast serif, this very condensed sans serif, the text on angles. There's some overprinting, giving it sort of this kinetic effect. And in compositions such as this, the postmodernists maintained an allegiance to the international style while still finding abstract ways to solve design, quote-unquote, problems. In 1976, April Grieman opened her own design firm and really began to experiment with hybrid imagery. So starting to kind of bring about this sense of digital technology with hand-drawn practices. So this is actually a 5-color offset lithograph publicizing a poster show at MoMA in New York. And you can see some of these futuristic passages created from manipulation of imported video, which you can kind of see here. Bringing those into the poster. And she creates this 3D illusion by overlaying objects and putting the text on an angle, and really sort of opened up her into making her own individual style. And you can see the influence of Weingart in her work through the transparency, the halftone, the jagged geometric forms. April Grieman was actually one of the first graphic designers to make use of the new powerful tools that would eventually transform the profession completely. And this is in 1984 when she bought a Macintosh personal computer. The computer, actually the first Mac by Steve Jobs, was aimed at graphic designers, and that's sort of why it's still used so much in the profession today. She viewed the computer not just as a functional tool, but something that was given her the ability to experiment a way that opened up new avenues of unexpected design. So I want to, stress the fact, and I know that I've said this in class, it is a tool. It is a tool that we use. So it doesn't make you creative, but it's a tool to let you sort of show your creativity. This was one of her first generation digital experiments, and it was she did this for Design Quarterly. It was a 32-page magazine that opened up into one long horizontal poster. And what she did was she created a self-portrait of types with a timeline showing the history of technology that ends in the invention of the Macintosh computer. So you can see the idea of the photo collages, the drawings, the text. You can see even visible pixels. It created a chaotic impact, but still legible and readable and able to be understood. As in many postmodern designs, clarity and legibility have sort of been sacrificed in order to enhance the expressive aspects of the work. They abandoned the Bauhaus mantra of less is more and really started to celebrate this idea of visual excess. The three corporations that were, started to come about now with this computer revolution, Apple, Adobe, and Aldus. Aldus was actually bought by Adobe. They came together to establish a totally new system for graphic designers and typographers. So they combined Macintosh's WYSIWYG format, which if you don't know, it's what you see is what you get. The new laser printer with Adobe's PostScript language. Aldus actually came up with PageMaker, which kind of came before Quark Express, which came before InDesign. So really gave the opportunity for any designer to produce camera-ready typeset quality work without having to leave the studio or employ a typesetting firm. William Weingart also had a significant impact on schools in the States, and this was definitely apparent at the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan. Catherine McCoy was the co-chair of the graphic design program at Cranbrook and really had a more daring outlook than most academics, and invited her students to explore new trends. So if you think about Yale, had all the Bauhaus instructors and Paul Rand, and most of the professors that came from the Swiss international style, Catherine McCoy was really embracing the postmodern style at Cranbrook. She favored the idea that reading the text and viewing the image should not be conceived as a discrete practice. She believed that reading and viewing overlapped and should interact synergistically in order to create this holistic effect that features both modes of interpretation. And even to this day, many graphic design programs in American university features curricula that are still more focused on the international style rather than the postmodern style. So this is a poster that she designed by Alan Horry called Typography as Discourse. And Catherine McCoy called her creation of deconstructed graphic design Typography as Discourse. So this was for one of her lectures. And what this means is that the meaning of a work is part of a conversation between text and image. So it cannot be fixed to form one stable result. It's a conversation. So this is publicizing a lecture by her. And his cluttered image has a number of references to Weingart's work. However, his design is mostly focused on using letter as image more than text. So a lot of the letters you see here, you don't necessarily need to read. And they become illustrations, like they become texture. So many of the abstract shapes that make up the composition are made from letters. And this was a poster for Cranbrook designed by Catherine McCoy, and it was promoting the design program at the school. And at first you might think this is information design, but if you look closer, the connection really is disjointed. So there's a lot of overprinting, and overprinting on the image are a series of paired terms that really serve to signify the emphasis on critical thinking that was a big part of the curriculum at Cranbrook. But you can see these, even the color separations, the linear elements, and you wouldn't necessarily need to read this whole thing, but it almost draws you in, that makes you want to read what's sort of underneath the different imagery and textures. So it's very important to note how the modern international style was distinguished from postmodernism by the amount of expression permitted on the artist's part. So staunch modernists usually suppressed, they held back any quirky or whimsical elements in their designs, while postmodernists welcomed this. They used these idiosyncratic displays of personal style, such as those present in the work of Cranbrook-educated designers. This is a poster by Ed Fella, and he received his MFA from Cranbrook, and he was sort of a non-traditional student in that he had worked as a commercial artist for 30 years previous to this. And he kind of engaged with this deconstructive theory, which had a huge impact on his style. He produced a series of posters in Detroit that really sealed his reputation as a creator of visually rich experimental work that, again, as you can see, would harken back to the works of Dada. Jeffrey Keedy was another Cranbrook graduate who really started working into type design. So he mixed his interest in vernacular signage and deconstructive theory and started to work on what would become the typeface Keedy Sans. So he really wanted to create a typeface that was visually challenging, rejecting the clarity and internal logic, but still was readable. So he didn't want to make it illegible. But you can see there's all these different weird cuts, tiny little dots of the eyes, but it's still very readable and, in my opinion, very beautiful. So in the Netherlands and Britain, another influential designer of the 80s, whose studio was based in The Hague, really started to develop an international following. This is his poster for the Holland Festival. You can see here three-dimensional elements, really in his posters creating this imaginary world where your eye isn't necessarily connected to any one thing. Even though it does have a sense of visual hierarchy, there's this kinetic energy in the layout due to these text on an angle, and just the way the eye is kind of led around and around and around with these vibrant colors as well. So it is quite beautiful. Neville Brody in the 80s became one of the most sought after graphic designers in Europe, as he did a lot of work in record album and magazine design. And he really had a big impact on what was seen before as the dying art scene in Europe. He was the art director of The Face, which was a London-based lifestyle magazine, and he also explored the limits of legibility while devising new ways of showing the beginning and end of a feature, redefining the relationship of text to photography, and experimenting with new typographic styles. So this is a spread that he did for the Face magazine. It's an article about workwear. And he used the type, spread it across the page, across the spread, running type vertically, and really kind of makes the viewer an active viewer. So you kind of have to both interpret the article not just through its content, but also through the design of the pages. And this is another dynamic cover that he created for the cover, in which the photograph completely bled off the page. This is the lead singer of the band New Order, and usually, like in Rolling Stone and other magazines, they'd show the whole person. Well, he really closely cropped so that you can really just see the eye and the top of the singer's head. But really knew that he needed to keep his design functional. But use his design and the different experimentation he did to enhance rather than hinder the reader's experience of a given article. Tibor Kalman was a founder of New York firm M & Company, and he became known in the 80s for his witty explorations of the culture of the United States. He was a self-taught designer and actually became a political activist in the late 1960s. And his career is really a good example of two major trends in contemporary graphic design. The first is the embrace of political activism, which sort of went against what the international designers or international styles designers did. Also, the rise of the self-taught designer. So the computer did bring about this rise of people that didn't necessarily go to college to study graphic design. So there's a lot of different contemporary graphic designers, such as Tibor Kalman, David Carson, Art Chantry, and they all made the point that their outsider status allowed them the freedom to explore unusual alternative design concepts. So they weren't just stuck with what they were trained to do in school. So this is the cover that Tibor Kalman did for the Talking Heads. And he actually collaborated with David Byrne. The lead singer of the Talking Heads is actually a really good designer as well. And he mixed a reference to the abstract, decorative, tantric paintings derived from Hindu and Buddhist culture with a photo of a chair turned in various positions. So sort of making sense out of nonsense. The lettering splits up the words into unintelligible syllables. As you can see here, there's weird spaces between the words, which is an allusion to the garbled religious speech mentioned in the album's title. So that idea of speaking in tongues. This is another poster that he did, an advertisement for a restaurant, and he took the look of a typical signage in a modest American diner. You've seen these where they change out the specials every day on these little letter boards, and actually used it for an advertisement for the hip restaurant. Nowhere in the introduction of digital technology more rapidly integrated into practice than in the typography community. So all of a sudden, this Macintosh computer has come out, and it really changed every aspect of type design. In just a few short years, all of the older systems for setting type began to vanish. So there was no more typesetters, no more people doing code and spitting out type paragraphs that could be pasted onto boards. Typography all had to live on the computer. And the California design team of Rudy Vanderlands and Susanna Litko founded Emigre Graphics in 1984. Vanderlands also worked for the San Francisco Chronicle, but he was inspired by the idea that people read best what they read most, and found the design of the paper to be perfectly legible to its daily readers. And he because he worked on this paper on the side project at Emigre Graphics, he realized that there was a lot of experimentation that could be done outside of the rules of the international style. So he founded Emigre magazine, and the first issue shows his reaction against the international style as he laid out torn, collaged photographs in a disoriented fashion along with typewriter type. He used the photocopier and really took fragments of popular culture to create unconventional new designs. While the use of the photocopier reflected the low budget of the magazine, it also showed his tendency to use common everyday sources for experimentation, which is really a huge postmodernist trait. And he really wanted to make graphic design a medium that allowed for the intuitive expression of the artist. So again, combining that idea of the designer as artist. So this is the first issue. I will post a link on Blackboard. You can actually go to Letterform Archive. They have an online archive. You can see all of the Emigre magazines that were done in PDF form. But you can see here the chaotic text. It's typewriter text, torn out images from newspapers and magazines. Still legible, though. Zuzana Litko, who was his partner at Emigre, was born in Czechoslovakia but came to the U.S. as a young girl, and she became one of the first typographers to work with the newly released Macintosh computer. She used a program called Font Editor and started to use the technology for the basis of new typefaces and a new aesthetic that really began to her invention of new forms. She used this idea of the screen, and at the time it was still very bitmapped. So the dot matrix printer could only display 72 dots per inch. So she created these bitmap typefaces using the Macintosh computer, and they really are characteristics of this postmodernist genre. And this is another spread from the Emigre magazine. This is the third issue. And Zuzana Litko's typefaces started to be used for the design of the magazine, which, became more and more focused on experimental graphic design. And the third issue was the first one in which her typefaces were used instead of the typewriter type. And this technology quickly evolved. After the release of PostScript, which allowed the typefaces to be smooth, they got rid of that bitmapped look. She continued to produce fonts that expressed fundamental parameters of the technology with which they were produced. So this typeface is called Modula, and it's still designed on the proportions of her bitmapped, but instead of the stair step, they became smooth. And this is Template Gothic by Barry Deck. I have to admit, when I was in college, this is like one of my favorite typefaces to use when I first got my own Macintosh computer. And this was one of the most successful releases by Emigre. Deck studied under Ed Fella. He created this in a sort of hybrid mix that mixes the wavering line of hand-drawn letters with the firm structure of sans serif. And it really is the first early example of grunge typography. And even though this is smooth, and I know this is kind of a crappy image, you can see this in your book, it still has that aspect of being out of focus, which it isn't out of focus, but it was really interesting in that way. And just these, tapered stems, it's such a lovely typeface. And because of this computer revolution in type, a new business needed to be set up in order to serve the needs of new technology. So Bitstream was founded by Mike Parker, Matthew Carter, Cherie Cohn, and Rob Freeman, and it was one of the first firms to develop a library of digital fonts. So just like the American Type Foundry started sort of grouping and collaborating and licensing metal type, the ITC actually not the ITC, but Bitstream did that for digital typography. And really, the business was the creation and sale of digital versions of typefaces, everything from Bodoni to Helvetica. This is a typeface designed by Neville Brody called Arcadia. And it was really rooted in an alphabet that he had designed for a section of the magazine with a very strong vertical emphasis, high contrast, hairline crossbars, and really you can kind of see the influence of the Art Deco fonts such as Broadway. So if you remember, the chapter started with a debate in the early 70s between Wim Crowell and John Von Torn, which really continued well into the next decade. So in 1992, another version of this debate broke out when Paul Rand resigned from Yale when the school selected Sheila Levrant de Bretteville as the new director of graphic design. So she brought a commitment to exploring critical theory, but also had an awareness of design's potential for social activism. If you remember, Paul Rand was a strict international style, wanted to keep everything neutral, everything non-politicized. But unfortunately, he was sort of the old guard, so he was clearly swimming against the tide, because by the 1990s, postmodernism had been established as much more than just a passing fashion. It really swept away any established truths and set the stage for a new generation of designers.